Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we're going to be speaking with Erik Bernhardsson. He was most recently the CTO of Better, which is a startup changing how mortgages are done. He joined the company back in 2015 when they were under 10 people. Recently, they were valued at $6 billion. Erik has a knack for joining companies early because he was also an early employee at Spotify, joining back in 2008 when they were a small team of 30. He's an extremely unique thinker and has lots of opinions to share. Erik is now exploring his own startup in the data space. He's a prolific writer and tweeter, and on this episode, we're going to talk about Luigi and the future of orchestration. We'll touch briefly on ML, and we'll discuss the chasm between data analytics and data science. We covered a lot of ground in this episode. Tristan, what do you think? What was something that you learned?
This conversation is the one that has really kept me on my toes. Erik can go wherever you want to go, and I've been fortunate to have a couple conversations now with Erik, and you always have to be ready to go wherever. I particularly enjoyed how Erik traverses the line nicely between data tooling and organizational culture, because those two things, you can tend to really get focused on one or the other, but really you need both in order to really transform the way that a company operates.
This was a fun episode for me because Erik has such a breadth and depth of opinions. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Erik, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I just want to start by really stirring the pot right out of the gate. So you and Max B released Luigi and Airflow at roughly the same time. And Airflow became a little more popular than Luigi, I think. So are you and Max B now arch nemesis?
I've actually never met him or talked to him. But so I would assume the answer is yes. I think going back, I wish I could have spent a little bit more time on Luigi, but frankly, I sort of dropped the ball in 2015 when I went to Better, and then, stopped maintaining it. So I don't know. I always thought about what could it have been? I don't know. Maybe it could have been bigger than Airflow. Maybe not. Who knows? We'll never know.
Luigi was first, Tristan.
Is that right?
Yeah. So it could be that Airflow is standing on the backs of giants of Luigi. So
there was one more in that. Was it called Azkaban? That was a similar?
Yeah,
product, right?
There was Azkaban from LinkedIn. There was also Uzi.
Right.
Which always looked terrible to me. Someone the other day said about Luigi that you either live to become a villain or you die a hero. He said about Luigi. So with the implication that at least it died a hero. So
Nice.
I take this as some solace.
I appreciate the backstory there. Well, I was doing some LinkedIn stalking in advance of this, and I'm seeing you jump around from different places in your life. I'd be interested to hear just where you've lived in your life. It looks like Germany and Sweden are on the list. You're now in New York, I think. Where has your life taken you?
I grew up outside Stockholm and spent the first, 25 years of my life there or something like that. Lived briefly in Germany and briefly in Switzerland, then went back to Germany a little bit, Sweden. And then when I was 27, I guess, I moved to New York. And I've now lived for 10 years in New York.
Was that a Spotify move? Or was that personal?
It was, somewhat convoluted. I had a brief internship in New York at a hedge fund, the Shaw, and I liked it quite a lot. And then, and then I went to Sweden and worked at Spotify, but I was kind of, in a way, missed New York. And then I got a job in the financial industry in New York and left left Spotify and so moved to New York and loved the city, but didn't like my company. So after 5 months, I actually left the hedge fund and went back to Spotify, but this time in New York.
One of the reasons that I'm so excited to talk to you today is because you just have this consistent ability on your blog to take these very complex topics and distill them into the most important frameworks or what's really going on here. I do a lot of writing myself and have a lot of respect for the ability, just how much work it takes to distill some of these complex topics. Do you have a secret? Is this just how your brain is wired? Do you have a good editor? How do you do this?
I don't know. I mean, I started writing 10 years ago, and for a long time I was just writing for no one. And I think that was like part of it. It was no one gave a shit, and I just kept writing.
10 people showed up today. It's
yeah, right. Like I literally remember like going to Google Analytics and like, wow, there was like 50 people on my blog today. Like and like some forum in China, they had like discovered some random thing. That was maybe like 7 years ago. But like I think that was like part of it. I just kept writing because like I felt like I had a lot of like random things I wanted to write down myself. And in the end, like people started reading it, and so that was obviously fun.
Yeah.
Maybe I would have given up if they hit. I don't know.
I can't remember. I was recently listening to a podcast of somebody who I feel like the earliest bloggers really were like these folks that were in investing, and they like started publishing newsletters that they would actually fax out to like this list of humans. I can't remember. This big hedge fund guy. He's like been doing it for 50 years. He's literally been running a newsletter for 50 years via fax.
Nice.
So it's a very satisfying thing to do, and we are not the only ones to discover that. I also want to note that you are one of the few humans who has, at the very highest levels, run like pure data organizations and the broader software engineering organizations. Can you compare and contrast the experiences there? Like it seems like data keeps drawing you back, but you also did a big thing at Better. Like what's more fun? How do you compare them?
I don't know. Like I'm biased. I think data is a lot more fun in a way. But I was a CTO at Better for 6 years, and I ran front end and back end and QA and even IT and at some point technical recruiting and a bunch of other stuff, also product. And I think those are all like fun stuff. Like at the end of the day, like I think what I realized about myself is like I like to build things, and so that's a way of getting to do that. I think I don't know, like data. I think what's different about data is like people don't really like. There's less of like best practices in data. Like people are kind of just still trying to figure out like how do we work with data? Like what's the best tools? And I think that can be frustrating too. I mean having now been coding for almost 30 years, and I've been in the tech industry working for 15 years or something like that. Like I think it's interesting. It kind of feels like data is like where front end and back end was like 10 years ago. People still kind of trying to figure out like best practices, like how do we write code? Like how do we test it? How do we deploy things? Like no one knows. And so that's like, I think a big difference, like working in data. And I think the reason is like data didn't really exist 10 years ago. Like when I was doing data at Spotify, like no one really cared. But now it's like a lot of people are doing data. And so let's figure out the infrastructure. And that's a big difference.
It's drawn you back specifically because there is so much more to figure out.
Absolutely. Right. Like I think if that wasn't the case, I mean, I was, I love data too. Like I was been working on it, but I also think, there's a massive opportunity right now. There's just so much stuff to do, and which I think is extremely exciting. A lot of people want to do things, but the tools and the ways of doing things, I don't think they're like at all anywhere close to where like front end and back end is. Like when I like, see people like put together like a web app in React and, in like half a day, like to me, it's like amazing what people can accomplish, versus like, 10 years ago, you had to build everything from scratch using HTML and like jQuery. And so to me, I really hope we can see something similar in the data world.
Yeah, you had this awesome blog post about giving more tools to software engineers, the reorganization of the factory. And you had this really interesting concept in there that if it gets cheaper to build software, demand for it is just going to get bigger and bigger. And
totally,
I think that's like exactly right. Also happening in the data space. If we have data warehouses that can process and store data far more cheaper, then I think the world in which we use data in ways that we've never used it before just becomes more and more a reality.
Totally. So I think it's both the cost, goes down. It makes it, easier to build things. But I also think another thing that like, I think to me points to the same conclusion is like the fact that like, in a way right now, there's a lot of tools to kind of build around engineers. And some people might look at it and say like, okay, maybe we won't need data engineers and data scientists in the future. To me, it's like actually the opposite conclusion, which is like, okay, like people are trying to work around that. That means like they don't get enough what they want from the engineers. So, back in the days, like I remember when like, the web came, like there's a lot of like kind of WYSIWYG tools to build websites because like no one knew how to hire a front engineer. There's of course, like in the long run, there's going to be both like AWS and there's going to be like Squarespace in this industry. Like it's interesting, like what those two things are going to look like. They're very different things. But I think we're going to need both.
We just covered so much. I think we got a little taste of your building Luigi at Spotify. We didn't get into quite yet your time as CTO at Better. I think one of the things we love so much is just your writing. But I'm going to take everyone back. So we're going to rewind all the way back to when you joined Spotify. One of the most amazing things is you joined in 2008 as an intern. There were only 30 people at the company. And you've actually had great success at landing in great companies extremely early. Did you have any idea what Spotify would become when you joined, or did you just really, really like music?
I had no idea what Spotify was going to be. The odd thing is that I actually love music, but a lot of people at Spotify didn't really love music. I felt like I was like kind of an oddball there. When Spotify was like 500 people, I think I was like number one in terms of, employee listening to music at some point. Why did I join Spotify? I actually turned on an offer from Google and everyone thought it was crazy. But the real reason I joined it was just like there was a bunch of people from my school that were all like super smart, and I just wanted to work with them. And I felt like, I don't know, maybe this is going to work out, maybe not. But like either way, I'm going to work with smart people, and that seemed like a desirable thing in itself. And then it did work out, so I'm very grateful for that. But that wasn't really like part of the equation when I joined, and so I guess it was lucky. Is a long way of saying.
Lucky and right place, right time, but also smart to be thinking about these kinds of problems. So Tristan alluded to it, but when you were there, you built Luigi. That became really popular. You open sourced it in 2012, I believe. Airflow came a little bit later. One of the things that Airflow had was a built-in scheduler, which was a fundamentally different architecture than Luigi. Luigi was more built in with Hadoop. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know. Like Luigi had a separate scheduler. It was just kind of like annoying to like configure, and I think it didn't do a good job like having this like web interface. And I think that's what people wanted from Airflow. It's like it kind of by default had this like server architecture with like a web-based web interface. I think that the fact, Luigi, yes, it came with a bunch of tools for Hadoop, but I think that was a little bit of a misunderstanding. I think a lot of people had that it was like built for Hadoop, but you could use it for a lot of other stuff too. Spotify ended up using it for a lot of Hadoop, and then sort of Hadoop fell out of flavor. And I think there's a little bit like a misassociation. But I mean, we used Luigi for a lot of stuff that had nothing to do with Hadoop as well.
But it seems like there's been like some evolution in the orchestration space, right? So Airflow is probably the predominant scheduler today. But in the past few years, we've seen a couple new entrants. The ones that are on our radar are two companies called Prefect and Dagster. The company's called Elemental. The open source project is Dagster. And they're both trying to solve things a little bit differently in that when things are running well, great, we don't want to step in your way, but it's the case where you have bad data or your pipelines fail. That's where Prefect and Dagster says Airflow falls short and we want to have an alternative solution. Do you think we're arriving at the ultimate solution for orchestration, or is there yet another wave that these newer players are not quite getting right?
Yeah. I mean, there's Dagster, there's Prefect, there's also Metaflow, there's Flight, there's a bunch of other ones. So I think that's pretty exciting. To me, I think kind of thinking more like generally about like infrastructure as a whole, like not workflow scheduling specifically, but I feel like workflow schedule is sort of symptomatic of this. Like I always feel like when I look at all of these tools, infrastructure is this like annoying thing you have to do in the end. You write the code and it's like you kind of have this like scripts running, locally in your computer, and you kind of run them in sequence, and like you kind of build them without any sort of thinking about workflow scheduling. And then in the end, you're like, shit, like I got to like productionize it. I got to figure out like Docker. I got to figure out containers, like Terraform, Kubernetes, like Airflow, whatever.
Different skill set too. Yeah.
It's just like chore in the end. To me, that reflects poorly on like all sort of infrastructure, like the fact that it's this like annoying thing in the end. Why couldn't it be something that like helps us build things in the first place? And maybe that's like something I when I look at like DBT that does well. Like DBT, I actually get the feeling like people aren't like first writing SQL queries in like a text editor and like later like copy pasting them into DBT. They like write them as a part of DBT from scratch because like, they feel like they're getting more stuff done doing so. Like, and to me, that's like a sign of like a framework that actually, helps people and, gets people more productive.
You didn't start writing HTML and CSS and then like backport it into Rails. Like you just wrote ERB files.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. Right. Like you stick them in the templates direct. I never use Rails, but whatever you do, like it's sort of, Rails is a way that helps you get more productive. And that I think is something that generally applies to infrastructure as it exists today, especially in the data world. This is like infrastructure is still this like chore in the end. And I think what infrastructure has to become is something that actually helps engineers get more productive. To me, that's like the next sort of generation of data tools is whatever solves for that.
I feel like the big problem there that these tools are trying to contend with is that data workflows are so polyglot still that it is very hard to have any extremely strong assumptions about like exactly what they're going to. I mean, okay, maybe they will consume 1 to n data sets and they will output 1 to n data sets. And like, okay, maybe you can assume that. But there's so much diversity in the things that are trying to be coordinated. In a framework, you have to actually like assume some commonalities to be able to like increase the level of abstraction. Do you think that there's like a thread to be pulled on there? I mean, that's what DBT assumed everything's SQL. Okay, that doesn't work for everything.
I think maybe, yeah, like to some extent, right? Like, but like on the other hand, like I would say that like Python plus SQL is like 95% of data these days. Like there are people, of course, like doing stuff in R or like, you know, whatever, some crazy people doing, you know, training models in Rust or whatever. But like 95 or whatever, I'm just making this number, is like Python and SQL. And like, let's like look at like front end. Like at front end, you have like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? And I feel like they kind of happily coexist. So and in a way, like I think when I look at like, you know, frameworks, a lot of this sort of, you know, interesting innovations in the last 10 years has been like sort of interesting like hybrids or whatever. Like first it was like Angular. They're like, oh, we're going to put all the logic inside HTML. And then actually that was kind of a bad idea. And then like React like came and they're like, actually, let's like stick to, you know, HTML into JavaScript and like build this like JSX. And it was probably a little bit better idea because like clearly like people use it, and you know I've used it, and it's like kind of weird at start, you know, when it begin, but then it sort of realized actually it like makes me pretty productive, and so I'm not saying like that's necessarily the solution is like, you know, kind of like invent new languages that are hybrid, but I think, you know, it points to me that like, you know, languages can sort of coexist, and maybe we need to, you know, draw inspiration from front end to kind of figure out like what does that look like, you know, because I think you're right in the sense that there is, you know, a little bit of a chasm between like Python on one side of the spectrum and like SQL on the other side of the spectrum. Like, I don't know, like maybe we need a new language that's like Python inside SQL or SQL inside Python or whatever. Like, I don't know. But I think to me, like that seems like kind of an interesting, maybe that's the thread to pull in. It's like, what does that look like? I don't know. But there's an interesting bridge there, I think, that has to be built.
You wrote about like that chasm between SQL and Python as a potential area of you that you wanted to investigate for potentially a new company or some ideas that are particularly interesting to you. Are you talking about the language specifically, or is there more to that in the actual practice of data science and analytics and bridging those worlds?
I really don't know. And I have like far more questions than I have answers here. But like, I think, you know, the only sort of, you know, observation I have is like, I don't think it should be either like 100% of either, right? Like, you know, like 10 years ago, like people try to put everything into database, like, you know, triggers and store procedures and all kinds of stuff. And they're like, actually, like a lot of that should probably be app code. And then, you know, and I think, you know, with the, you know, on the other hand, in the data world, like people are doing like Hadoop and they put all the code in like, you know, MapReduce. And they're like, actually, that's like a really bad idea. Like probably like SQL makes a lot more sense for a lot of this stuff. And so clearly, like there's like use cases where SQL is extremely valuable, and clearly there's use cases where like code is really valuable. And so I don't know, like I don't have any good answers here, but I think, you know, to me there's like an area sort of ripe for opportunity to figure out like, okay, how do these languages coexist? I think that's part of the infrastructure challenges.
I don't know if you follow the data platforms as closely as we do, but like one of the major trends that we're following is this seeming convergence of like what were primarily AI platforms, maybe let's say 4 years ago, and what were primarily data warehouses 4 years ago. And now it seems like Snowflake is building capabilities that look like Python, and it seems like Databricks is building capabilities that look more like a data warehouse. You were discussing languages on some level, but like maybe the convergence of the compute layer between those two languages is a part of the solution?
Maybe. I mean, like my sort of the skeptic inside me, you know, would kind of bounce the question back, like, do people actually use this? Like, I don't know. Like, I think, you know, you listen to Snowflake and like, you know, Bob Molio, whatever, like they're always talking about like everything should be inside SQL, right? Like, I don't know. Like, what if I have like a, you know, an S3 bucket with 80,000 PDFs? Like, I'm not going to put them in Snowflake. I don't know. To me, that's weird. So like, I don't know if necessarily everything's going to be relational and everything's going to be SQL. I think a lot of it should. Let's see what happens. But my feeling is like, we're not going to, in 10 years down the road, we're not going to, train convolutional neural networks inside Snowflake. Like I would bet against that.
That seems fair.
I think the reverse is true, though, that I think Databricks is mostly seen as an AI platform, but the amount of Spark SQL that's being used is really high, and people actually like doing a lot of relational work on their lakehouse. And that actually, I think, brings me to another point I wanted to talk about with you is you very recently wrote a short story about building a data team, and it was a fictional story about the protagonist joins a company. I don't think we know if it's a he or a she, which I like. There was a lot of she pronouns.
Genderless protagonist.
I did pick up on that, which was awesome. But the protagonist starts at a company, has to set up the data team, make the data team successful. And one of the underlying messages I got here was like, we'll get to the AI stuff eventually. There's so many more things that we have to solve before we can get to the cool, fancy data science. It sounds like that was intentional.
Totally. I'm really happy you picked that up, because that was sort of like, I never wrote that down. And initially I was like going to end the whole blog with like a long list of like kind of, moral lessons. But then I was like, no, I'm just going to leave it to the reader to sort of see, because also the blog post was like way too long. But like, I think that's exactly the point that I was trying to make, was part of that. And like part of that, why I think a lot about, like, I used to work in the mortgage industry. I was in the mortgage industry for 6 years. And I would meet all these like mortgage like CTOs and CIOs at like, conferences or whatever. And they're like always like talking about like, oh, we're going to use like AI for this and AI for that, profile our customers and build like churn prediction model. And I'm like, I just want to ask them, like, do you know like at what stage in your conversion funnel the users drop out? Do you even know the conversion rate? Like, do you even know like, what sort of campaigns that you have, the lowest CPC? Like, and so to me, like I talk to all these companies and I'm like, I don't even know if they like, know how like basic stuff about like user behavior on their website. And I think, there's this like hierarchy of needs I've written about in my blog before. Like first, like you just need to start by like just building like basic data like a data warehouse and track users behavior. And then, and then you can start to build like a little bit of like models and trying to, but like don't jump to the AI stuff. That's a waste of time. Like unless you really like kind of mastered all the other levels before that. I think there's just so much like basic stuff about like, so much of the value that I found it better was like never about training machine learning models. It was like detecting that like, oh, there was like a bug on iOS Safari because of something with local storage. And now we have a big drop off on this page. And that's going to save us millions and millions of dollars. Like if you fix that.
What I feel like is so interesting about that perspective is that it's coming from you. Like you were winning algorithm competitions when you were young. You like built the seeds of Spotify's recommendation algorithm. Like you're an ML person and you're saying like, hey, you can get to the ML later. That's a perspective that a lot of practitioners, especially early career practitioners in that field, don't necessarily share. Like when you're managing somebody and having a conversation with them and they're saying like, hey, I thought I was going to get to do ML work, which is something that people say in this story a lot. How do you have that conversation with them?
I mean, I think maybe part of that is that I did all this machine learning stuff. So like, I think, I've been like saying this like semi-jokingly that like, part of the benefit of knowing a lot of machine learning is that I know all the stuff that machine learning is not very good for. And I think, where like you should just use like basic stuff. Maybe the other reason is like I kind of got the like ML out of my system. Like I already did a lot. So I never felt like a desire to like, necessarily like make things more complicated than it has to be, when there's a simple SQL query that does the same, that can deliver more value. I don't know if it's a paradox necessarily. I think, it's a whole toolbox. And I think it's been, I've had a long career and I've learned a lot of different tools in the toolbox, and I'm glad there's like occasionally there's like some machine learning thing that comes up and I can train a little model and like that predicts something, but in a lot of cases like that's not the right tool, and I think that's the most important thing. Like don't get too obsessed with the tools. Like focus on the goals.
I'd love to hear a little bit more because we often have pure data engineers or analytics engineers on the show. We don't often dive into the ML stuff, but we have your expertise here. I was curious, you did end up writing some of the core parts of the Spotify prediction model. And that was open source through Annoy, right?
That's kind of a
Small
small thing. I built basically the first version of Spotify's music recommendation system, and large parts of that of my code is apparently still running, from what I hear. So, and Annoy was like kind of like, a core part of that. I guess like the big idea with the Spotify's music recommendation system was to do what's called, I guess, like matrix factorization. Like the whole idea is like you're going to embed everything as like vectors. And when I started doing that many years ago, like there weren't really like good tools to work with those vectors. So I ended up writing this like C++ library with Python bindings to do high dimensional nearest neighbor searching. And so, yeah, that was like something I open sourced many years ago. And I think Spotify still uses and a bunch of other people still use. So that was like, kind of a fun little open source project. But, ultimately it's like a small sort of component in a much larger machine.
So, I mean, it boiled down to basically very high dimensional data that you stored in vectors, did some fancy matrix multiplication. Were you using something like a feature store? Was that built out internally at Spotify, or
no?
Is this a newer concept?
I feel like feature stores are like a later thing. And I'm actually a big proponent of feature stores, but I think feature stores, I mean, first of all, like, features to me tend to be more like kind of, what's the user's age and like how many items do they have in the shopping cart, and like those tend to be like what I think of as like features. Like whereas like what I was doing was more like vectors in like a latent space that have like zero meaning. Like it's like just the structure of that space that matters. I guess they're like sort of related in a way, and I think probably like vector models can benefit from feature stores. I think feature stores is kind of sort of an interesting platform area right now. Like I don't think there's like any prevalent tools these days, but it's clearly something a lot of companies want. And I think a lot of, what holds back, especially a real-time machine learning is in many cases, it's not training the models. Like training the models is relatively easy in many cases. Like you just take some data in the data warehouse and train it. The hard part is like, how do you productionize it with real-time predictions that are like, updated online? And that's where I think that the feature stores are super important. At Spotify, we kind of cheated the whole thing. We just like computed the music recommendations every night based on whatever data we had in the data warehouse. So it's kind of cheating. But as soon as you want to start doing anything in like real time or near real time, like, yeah, feature stores are super critical. We didn't do anything of that at Spotify, but I think it's a very interesting space. I think, it's going to be interesting to see. I know that Tecton and a couple of other people are working on it. So I think it's an interesting area I'm keeping an eye on.
How about it better? So you were CTO, so you overlooked pretty much the whole engineering organization. You had some experience building out data teams too. Were there interesting problem spaces that were either unique to the mortgage world or challenges that you saw at building better?
I don't know if there was like anything. I mean, like in a lot of ways, it's pretty like standard. I mean, like I not that it comes to data. I guess some of the like challenges that we have with data maybe were like, yeah, like somewhat, special to mortgage industry. Like there's extremely strict requirements on who can have access to what data. So I think, taking security and privacy very seriously, I think made it a little bit harder.
That's actually really interesting. I feel like that's a part of the modern data stack that is just kind of starting to churn right now, but really there's like not a ton of off-the-shelf stuff available. Did you have to build all of those capabilities in-house?
We had to do a lot of it. I think, starting with like, how do you get the data from our production database into our data warehouse? Like, and a lot of, existing tools out there, like they sort of assume that your database is open to the public, or you can sort of poke a hole in, or set up some IP, TCP tunnel or whatever. We didn't want to do that because like we were like super nervous, and I think there's also compliance reasons why you can't. And so we had to build a lot of that ourselves. But there's also a lot of like, I don't think we solved it at better. But I agree, like it is like a really fascinating thing. I think a lot of companies are going to struggle with like who has access to what tables. And not just tables, but like columns and like rows in those tables. There's a lot of just like ETL pipelines at Better that are only about like stripping out like data that people shouldn't have access to before it makes it into the data warehouse. So absolutely, I think there's a lot of work to be done there too.
Yeah, there's like the question of how much goes into the data warehouse in the first place versus how much becomes like a governance layer that sits on top of the data warehouse. And then there's the concern about like, well, if there's like a layer on top of the data warehouse that's doing governance, does that add latency and decrease performance? And so it's like, I don't know. I'm very interested in all of this. It's not clear to me exactly how it's going to go.
And I think the answer is maybe as much as possible number two, right? Like, because you don't want to, ideally you keep as much of the raw data as you can in the data warehouse. You just restrict access to those schemas or tables, right? unless it really violates, like, probably don't want to store like social security numbers and like raw text and stuff like that, and passwords or whatever. So some of the stuff you can solve like using encryption. But generally, like I would say, like, you want to keep as much data as you can in the data warehouse and then apply a layer of governance on top of that. And that to me is still an unsolved problem, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of refreshing to see some industries that do need to take privacy and security to a really high standard are still comfortable using cloud. You often used to hear like, oh, I'm using a on-prem data warehouse, or I need to keep my data in appliances because it's more secure. And it's nice to see the transition, I think, more frequently now, with still big companies able to put maybe not the most sensitive data, but increasingly larger chunks in cloud.
Totally. And my question was always like, is really like the on-prem data center safer than like the cloud anyway? Like, who do you know? Like I used to work at a telco in Sweden, and like, there was a lot of people walking in and out because we shared a data center with a bunch of other companies. Like, I don't know, like there's like people walking in and out of the data center like all day, like plugging in racks and like moving cables. Like, so I always like thought that was funny. Like, and I think, people realize the truth that like probably cloud is very secure, luckily.
In your career, I guess you've worked in some industries that maybe are hot now, but weren't at the time. So music, people didn't think that was a great industry to build a big business in initially. Maybe mortgages as well, probably going through that transition now of this is maybe an industry that hasn't been disrupted in a while. Why were you drawn to those types of problems, or what advice do you have for people trying to break into traditional industries?
I think everything always looks cool in hindsight, right? Like I joined, maybe mortgage will actually probably never look cool, but like I joined Spotify, and like everyone's like, why don't you just go work for Google? It's like a really cool company, and like but like I guess I was lucky to not do that, because I ended up having a fantastic journey, and Spotify obviously in the end ended up, I think it's fair to say, transformed the music industry and how people consume music. And I think part of that journey was also like kind of realizing like, if you're a group of like kind of smart people and working hard and like with a good idea, you can actually change an entire industry. And so like what I thought a lot about over the next few years that working at Spotify was like, what are other industries where the consumption model is broken? And looking around in the world, it seemed to be, the case that entertainment, publishing, communication, those kind of industries, like they were all getting disrupted. So what was like the next thing? And I became convinced, like, financial services, like real estate, education, healthcare. I mean, I guess education and healthcare is like so regulated, it's kind of hard. But like part of why I ended up joining Better was like, it really fit that thesis that I had at that time. Besides the fact that like the people, early at Better were just, super brilliant, and I just wanted to work with them. I think a lot of it was just like, it fit that thesis that I had that time, that, there's something obvious to be built here. Like, why are people like faxing documents to a mortgage loan officer? It doesn't make any sense. I don't know what's like the next 10 years going to look like. I still look at a lot of like financial services. It looks like terrible to me. Like, why do we still have bank branches? Like, I don't know. To me, that seems like an area, but like, I think there's many other things, and it's always easy to look back and say, obviously, like taxi industry was going to get disrupted because of iPhones, but you always know those things in hindsight, I guess.
Hey everyone, just dropping in to let you know that the annual Analytics Engineering Conference, Coalesce, is back. We had the first Coalesce last year in December, and it was fantastic. We had 3,000 registrants, tons of presentations, and this year is going to be even bigger. Register for free at coalesce.getdbt.com.
You're a super asymmetrical thinker. I love your tweets. In addition,
what does asymmetrical mean? I don't know what that means, but thank you for the compliment. Okay.
You don't go with the flow.
Okay.
You might not buy into what everybody else is thinking. You go your own path, and you're often right. What are you reading? How do you form your impressions and opinions about the world?
I mean, I've always been big on Twitter. Like, I feel like, especially since I had kids, I used to read a lot. Like, I used to read like 50 books a year, like just like random stuff, like history, whatever. And like, I would get like a period where I would only read like Chinese history or whatever. But I don't know. These days I have 2 kids, like I barely have time to read. And I guess like, like it's nice to have like Twitter, because like, if I have like 13 seconds, in between helping kid 1 with something and helping kid 2 with something, I can go on Twitter and like read what's going on with data tools.
After finishing the second kid's bedtime, I can count on like 2 hands the number of times that I've said like, okay, let's sit down and read a really dense book.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I used to sometimes when I had more time. Now I'm also starting a company so now like after the kids go to sleep, I go back and write code. But yeah, Twitter is great. I used to read a lot of blogs. I don't know. There's probably a lot of books I should read, but I never have time to read, unfortunately.
One of the funny conclusions that you came to in this reorganization of the factory post is that there's this relationship between the success of companies and the salaries that they're able to pay their software engineers and the tooling that their software engineers have built to make themselves more productive. And you drew this diagram, right? And there's like, it's like very complicated with like lots of boxes and lines. And I found it very resonant because I feel like there's a similar thing that's going on with data analysts and analytics engineers where you make data folks more productive. And that's been a lot of our impetus with DBT. And because they're more productive, you can pay them more. And there's this virtuous flywheel. Anyway, competitiveness of companies, if every company is becoming a software company in some way, is like highly reliant on their ability to like put great software engineers to work. Are all legacy companies doomed to atrophy and die? Or is there a transition that can happen? Or is FANG going to take over the entire S&P 500?
It's funny you bring this up because I've been thinking a lot about this in the last few weeks. Like, I feel like when I think of it like investing, I used to read a lot about investing. It used to be something that was interesting. Like, there's always like interesting like asset classes that are like people discover some, in the 80s and 70s, it was like private equity. People realized, oh, you can like, do this like corporate raids and like restructure, whatever and divest stuff and like, take on a lot of debt and make a lot of money. And then like, people started figuring out how to do that. And then like what ended up happening with that asset class was like returns kind of normalized. And then people got really excited about like hedge funds in the 90s and like, started making a lot of money, like finding like arbitrage opportunities between whatever, carry trade on like Russian rubles. But I don't know. But like, and then like sort of that normalized and like now you don't make a lot of money from hedge funds anymore. Like, not like, that much. And so like, I wonder if also something like similar with like all opportunities in a way where like, in the last like 10 years, there was this like amazing opportunity where like people realized like, actually, let's like just, look at all these like old school, like legacy companies and just like rebuild them using software. And like, and I actually think that trend could continue for another 10 years, and like, in the same as like Better and Spotify in a way or Netflix or whatever. I think, there's still a lot of stuff that, hasn't like fully morphed, and that internet hasn't touched. But like eventually I feel like maybe those things will normalize. Like I look at like Walmart, like I ordered some stuff on Walmart the other day online because they had like a really good price for something I wanted, some outdoor furniture. And it was like great experience. And so like, I don't know, maybe these companies are like kind of figuring it out. And I don't know, like, so maybe like the opportunities on the consumer side, over time will diminish. And like maybe the opportunities, I mean, one theory I have is actually in a way like tools might be more interesting because all these like consumer tools are then going to need like their engineers are going to get more productive because of new tools. And then that is going to put more demand on like the tool sides. And I don't know, maybe the like the interesting, engineering problems and the interesting place to be for, smart people in the next 20 years is going to be on the infrastructure and tool side. I don't know. That's one thought I have, but I could definitely be wrong about that.
I have not personally been a part of a data team inside of a large traditional business, but we work with more and more of them. And the thing that I have been really impressed at just how openly the folks that we talk to are embracing, they're not even like open to it. They're like excitedly running towards the future of data and data tooling. So it's not an area that I have like extremely strong thoughts on, but I do certainly believe that
you should have strong thoughts on that. Like, I mean, like the CEO of a company in that space.
My strong thoughts are that you're exactly right that data tooling defines competitiveness and you will either need to be great at that or your company will atrophy. But I don't honestly have extremely strong thoughts around what companies will turn out to be able to be great at that and not.
I think to some extent, like what I also see a lot right now is like, pick some, random legacy companies, like they're going to look around and look at like all the like successful startups and see what tools they're using. And they're like, oh, they're using DBT. We're going to start using DBT. But then like the question is like, okay, what's the workflow? Like, what's the team organization? What's part of like why I wrote that blog post is also, I think sometimes like organization and processes sort of co-evolve with infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Yep,
And it's
yep,
not
yep.
just enough to like, you know, adopt the tools in the infrastructure. You also need to like redesign your whole organization and team. And so that I think is like, to me, when I look at around the industry, they're actually adopting like pretty good tools. I wonder if like what's missing now,
It's the org change.
yeah, it's the org change and the way they work together cross-functionally. Like that to me, like actually seems like a bigger opportunity to me, a part of why I wrote the blog post that I published yesterday.
I think sometimes big companies pick their tools for talent, right? I need to use the most exciting tools because my talent demands it. And
Maybe that's a good thing.
yeah, I actually think it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in the right direction, or those that don't figure it out will not survive.
I mean, like sometimes it's definitely a little bit of like cargo culting. They're like looking around. I mean, I remember like Spotify wrote this like blog post about like Matrix, you know, and then like all these companies were starting to adopt it. And like, you know, do you even know like what's like the thing driving this? Like, why are you doing it? Like, I think sometimes like it is, you know, to me, it's like a little bit like cargo culting in that sense. But like sometimes maybe cargo culting is good, right? Like, you know, if what they're replacing is like worse, then yeah, you know, it's not a bad thing, right?
All right, we're going to wrap up here. We asked this to all our guests, but looking out 10 years into the future, what do you hope to be true for the data industry?
I think the most important thing is just engineers being and data teams being a lot more productive. And like, what is it going to take to get there? I don't know. But I think a lot of it has to do with infrastructure and tools. Like, I think, you know, engineers and data scientists are spending so much time like configuring stuff and provisioning things, like waiting for things to finish, or like building things that like 35 other companies have already built. And to me, that's like a massive waste of human potential. And so a lot of what I hope to see in the next 10 years is like some sort of level of building tools that people can just like buy and use off the shelf that abstracts away all of that stuff. So people can focus on what's actually useful, which is to write business logic, right? And help the business get closer to its goals.
We couldn't be more aligned.
Thanks for hanging out. This has been a lot of fun. And thank you for all the writing you do. I would not have anything to link to if people like you didn't take the time to write all that down.
Great.
Where can people find you online if they're looking?
I mean, probably my blog, right? Like erikbern.com, ERIKBERN. That's probably the best place to start.
Thanks so much, Erik.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.